Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most just catastrophic battles in all of history. A single disastrous day that really helped shove the Roman Empire down that long road to collapse.
So, you know how we always talk about the fall of Rome like it was this slow, inevitable thing? Well, it wasn't quite like that. There were these flashpoints, these critical turning points where history could have gone a very different way. And honestly, few are bigger than a single, absolutely brutal battle fought on a scorching hot day, August 9th, 378 CE.
Okay, so to really get why this one battle was such a knockout blow, we've got to look under the hood. We need to see the cracks that were already spreading through the mighty Roman war machine. I mean, for centuries, right? Rome's heavy infantry was the gold standard. This disciplined wall of steel just conquered everything in its path. And this is a big but, beneath all that strength, the army had these two nagging chronic weaknesses. First, their cavalry was, well, kind of terrible. And second, they had this culture of glory-seeking commanders who were way too eager to rush headlong into a fight. And look, this wasn't a new problem. Not at all. We'd seen this movie before. Disasters like Cannae against Hannibal or Carrhae against the Parthians. Yep, same exact flaws. But now, in the late 4th century, the empire was about to run into an enemy that was tailor-made to exploit these weaknesses. And the results were going to be absolutely devastating. So how did we get here? Well, the whole thing kicks off with a massive humanitarian crisis. You have these terrifying Huns pushing west, and in front of them, entire Gothic tribes fleeing for their lives. They show up at the Danube River, the Roman border, basically begging for refuge. The Romans agree, but the plan for smooth integration, it just falls apart. Corrupt Roman officials start exploiting the Goths, leading to starvation, desperation, and pretty soon a full-blown, violent rebellion. The Emperor Valens, he was impatient. He wanted glory, and he wanted it now. So he completely ignores his general's advice to wait for backup. Instead, he marches his men for hours in the brutal summer sun and just throws his exhausted infantry at the Goths' defensive circle of wagons. And that is exactly when the trap snaps shut. The Gothic cavalry, the cavalry Valens thought was miles away, they come thundering back and smash right into the unprotected Roman flank. The whole thing just turns into an absolute slaughter. The results, I mean, it was a catastrophe on a scale Rome had rarely seen. Think about this. An estimated 2/3 of the entire Eastern Roman field army gone, wiped out in a single afternoon. And it wasn't just soldiers. The Emperor Valens himself died on that field, along with a massive number of his best officers and top government officials. A whole generation of leadership just erased.
We have an account from the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was actually alive when this happened. He described that moment with pure horror. He said the Gothic cavalry came down like a thunderbolt, spreading confusion and slaughter. That was it. That was the charge that shattered the legions and sealed their fate. But here's the thing. Losing an army, even losing an emperor, as devastating as that was, it wasn't actually the most important consequence of Adrianople. No, what truly changed everything was how the Goths themselves had changed as a threat.
See, before this, barbarian armies were mostly just raiders, right? They'd sweep across the border, grab some loot, cause some trouble, and then they'd go home. But the Goths, they were totally different. They were an entire displaced nation of refugees, running from the Huns. They had nowhere to go back to. They weren't fighting for loot, they were fighting for a home, for their very survival. And this is the crucial point. After winning this incredible victory, the Goths didn't leave. They stayed. So, for the first time ever, Rome now had to deal with an independent, armed, and unified barbarian nation living inside its own borders. They couldn't drive them out, and they had just proven they couldn't destroy them. This was a whole new ballgame. So the new emperor in the east, a guy named Theodosius, he steps in. And at first, he does what Romans always do. He tries to solve the problem with his army. But it doesn't work. His armies fail to defeat the Goths, too. So backed into a corner, he's forced to try something totally radical, totally controversial, something that had never been done before. In the year 380, Theodosius signs a treaty. It makes the Goths something called foederati. Now, what does that mean? It meant they were officially allowed to settle on Roman land, but not as subjects of Rome. No, they could live there as their own autonomous nation, with their own kings and their own laws. The only catch? They had to promise to fight in Rome's wars. This was a peace treaty born of pure desperation, and believe me, it would change the empire forever. Now, some people at the time called Theodosius the friend of the Goths. Yeah, right. Let me tell you about the cold, hard reality of that friendship. Years later, when Theodosius was fighting a civil war against another Roman, he put his Gothic allies right in the front line. Basically, used them as cannon fodder. After they took huge casualties, one Roman writer actually celebrated it as a double victory, one for Theodosius and one for the empire over the barbarians who had just died for them.
So that tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? This treaty wasn't about friendship, it wasn't a real alliance, it was a cold, cynical calculation to manage a threat they couldn't beat and then turn that threat's military power against other Romans. Okay, so the shockwave from Adrianople and this new policy of relying on barbarian allies, it forced the Roman military itself to change in two huge ways. We're talking both on the battlefield, tactically, and in the grand scheme of things, strategically.
First up, the tactics. The Eastern Roman army came up with a direct answer to that terrifying Gothic cavalry. They developed this new kind of heavy infantrymen who could form a dense spear wall to stop a charge dead in its tracks. But, and this is the cool part, they also carried bows, so they could plant their spears in the ground, unleash a storm of arrows, and then grab their spears again just in time to meet the enemy head-on. Super smart.
This new formation was just so much more versatile. The old legions were kind of a blunt instrument, very powerful but rigid. This new setup combined that hard outer shell of spearmen with a flexible core of troops with javelins and bows. It meant they could adapt to whatever the enemy threw at them way more effectively. But the bigger strategic change, well, it was the barbarization of the army. By relying more and more on these entire nations of foederati, a huge chunk of Rome's military was now made up of Germanic warriors. And who did they answer to? Their own kings first, and the emperor, well, maybe second. That's a huge problem for any empire.
So let's bring it all together. What was the ultimate legacy of this one single devastating battle? Where did this new path actually lead? Well, Adrianople and that treaty that came after it, it basically created a playbook. Other barbarian groups were watching. They saw that, hey, it's possible to beat a Roman army and then negotiate from a position of strength. And that gave them the idea to start carving out their own kingdoms right there on Roman land. And that process, the one started by the Goths, is what led directly to the Western Roman Empire breaking apart. Over the next 100 years or so, the West didn't fall to some single massive invasion. It just sort of dissolved. It became this mosaic of Germanic kingdoms. You had the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, the Franks in Gaul. Sound familiar? These are the literal foundations of the countries of medieval Europe, which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. Was the Battle of Adrianople just the end of an era for Rome? Or was it actually something more? Was it this bloody, chaotic, and totally unintentional event that didn't just destroy an old world, but also created the conditions for a brand new one to rise from the ashes?